Giving you enough time to get out of your food coma from Thanksgiving. It's Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. And what a night it's going to be. We'll get our annual update from our friend Galen Cook about the D.B. Cooper story. And there are several new developments in the story arc of the man who has been trying to, once and for all, solve the mystery of who was D.B. Cooper. And it was on this show back in 2007, I think now, that we first started our pursuit of this suspect named William Gossett. We put up a bunch of links to it, coasttocoastam.com, where you'll be able to follow along with the conversation here coming up in just a moment. Also, next hour on Coast to Coast, the author of a book called Deadly Powers, Animal Predators and the Mythic Imagination. But don't be dissuaded thinking this is just about, animals and cave drawings. His argument is extremely powerful and paradigm shifting. In fact, he is kind of swimming against the current of the consensus of academic opinion that we have been shaped as human beings not by being apex predators, but by being prey, and that we were prey for so much longer than previous anthropologists, archaeologists would have thought. And that being prey is what makes us who we are today. It explains everything. Actually, that's the most fascinating thing about it, is because there were so many animal predators around, and we were lunch so often. We were lunch constantly, not just, the occasional thinning of the herd, or that not only were we the kind of the easy pickings of the sort of mega predator world that existed for so long, and in some parts of the country, some parts of the world still does exist, and that the numbers of people in the world today who are still regularly eaten by mega predators, that is what makes us who we are. It's why we love monster movies. It's why we overkill. It's why we always think of ourselves in particular ways, which only make sense when you think that our brains were shaped by being prey. And we'll talk about that. Deadly Powers coming up next hour on Coast to Coast. And wow, what a bunch of great stories waiting for you at coasttocoastam.com. I'll tell you more about that, and then a quick announcement about an announcement on the way. On Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. So I had a fun time over the Thanksgiving holiday. I hope you did too. In fact, let me give a shout out to some of the people I've been having kind of an ongoing Twitter conversation with at my Twitter site, Deacon Punnett, DeaconPunnett. Shelter Nook, Eric with a K, Joe from NO, Caver68, Hazmat 1212, Commandant Crush, The Truth, Rob in Southern Cal, let's see, Devastation 79, McClintock 2, Caffeinated, KF Shaw, let's see, Rooster Pisces, which for the first week that I was looking at that web handle, I kept thinking of Rooster Pieces. I was like, oh no, you're an idiot. Rooster Pisces, Sippy Girl, Charles, enjoyed our conversation, Charles, about the Pentagon, and then, let's see, Jamek, Pup Tart, let's see, and then, Jess. Thank you, everybody, amongst others, that I've been enjoying kind of ongoing. I'll tweet you back. So if you write, we can stay on topic with what's going on here on Coast to Coast. It's great. And that reminds me, coming up this Tuesday night on Coast Insider, we'll be having the special conversation that we like to have. It's my turn. It'll be fun. Tuesday night, I'll be hosting the chat. And I'd love to have you be a part of that this coming Tuesday night if you're a Coast Insider. And it's not that you can't be, a great veteran coast-to-coast listener without being a member of Coast Insider, but it automatically gives you street cred, as even if you're a new coastie, you just say, yeah, I'm a Coast Insider. You're in. It's sort of like, it's just getting like a backstage pass. So you can find out more about becoming a Coast Insider at the website, coasttocoastam.com, and then we'll see you coming up this Tuesday night. I'll give you the first clue for an announcement I've got a week from tonight, too, but I'll only do that coming up Tuesday night while we're chatting. Have you gone to coasttocoastam.com tonight for the great stories in the news box? I'll just take you through them real quickly just so you know what's there. They found a new species, or confirmed a species, of ferret badger in Vietnam. This was at Cryptomundo. Love that website. But this speaks to the idea that many more animals, perhaps, than we realize, made up and create new kind of semi-species, right? Kind of fluke species, or maybe in this case even traditional species. But ferret badgers. And you can go take a look at the picture at if you go to coasttocoastam.com. And they know it's ferret, and you can tell that it's also part badger because it still don't care. If you get that joke, then you're very hip. And then also the story about something near and dear to my heart, keeping dentists away. I hate dentists. I'm such a dental phobe. And I love my dentist, nice guy. But we can still be friends. I don't actually have to sit there. And there's a new mouthwash that might pose the possibility that we could eliminate so many dental visits. You can go take a look at that story, put that up at Coast to Coast. And I couldn't get a story to load in. I don't know, maybe you can. So I couldn't tell you much more about it. 500,000 Russians are lining up to see the Belt of the Virgin Mary. The Belt of the Virgin Mary. And I don't know anything more about that, except that they also have her matching handbag and shoes. And at some point, they're going to put those up, too. That's all I can tell you. And then there's, from Wired magazine, 9 reasons that Wired readers should wear tinfoil hats. And they go into some very interesting stories, one of which I'd love to be able to follow up on, warrantless GPS tracking. This is something I've been very interested in finding out more about, and I'm trying to get to it. We're just having a hard time getting somebody who's experienced it, who wants to come on and talk about it. But it goes into all sorts of different reasons why we are being tracked, why we are being followed, and the ways in which this can be proven. But we can't always prove who's doing it. So go take a look at it. The 9 reasons that Wired readers should wear tinfoil hats, or 10 reasons if you think about the fact that we are still prey. Any little protection could help. We'll get to that coming up next hour. It's called Deadly Powers, and it's all about how our human minds were shaped by the fact that we were prey, not that we were predators. And this is kind of new for a lot of people out there, and with the details he'll get into, and why we do what we do because we're prey, not because we're predators. And we'll get to that coming up next hour on Coast to Coast. Always good to have our friend Galen Cook back on Coast to Coast. Galen is a lawyer who has also made it his life work to try to solve the D.B. Cooper mystery, and that's what brought us together back in 2007, and together we're still having fun pursuing this on the radio. Galen does this nearly full-time, as a series of articles have recently also featured Galen Cook's work. Perhaps you read one. Hey, Galen.
Hi, Ian. How you doing?
Good. Happy anniversary.
That's right. It's our 4th anniversary, Ian, and I want to thank you and the Coast to Coast listeners for helping keep this D.B. Cooper story alive, and we're pursuing much more newly discovered evidence on Coast to Coast.
Well, you know what? It's special. I feel like we should be sending gifts. So this is like even though it's the 4 years we've been doing this, is about the 15th show we've done on it, to the point where people call me obsessed. And that's okay, because I am obsessed. I think this is fascinating, and I think in our lifetime, we can solve the D.B. Cooper mystery. We're just always this one elusive clue or development away from being able to nail it down. We'll tell you more about what we've done in the past. Also look forward to it. But for people that just, give them the 2 or 3 minute thumbnail version of D.B. Cooper for people that may still be new to that topic?
I think by this time everyone's heard of D.B. Cooper, but basically 40 years ago, November 24th, 1971, a guy dressed up in a business suit and a briefcase walks into the Portland, Oregon International Airport, purchases a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle, hijacks that plane. It's a Boeing 727, Northwest Orient Airlines. The instructions he gives to the crew are to have 4 parachutes and $200,000 in American currency, and he'll release the passengers. They land the plane at about 5:30 p.m. in Seattle. They have the goods that D.B. Cooper requests. The passengers are released unharmed. Cooper retains 4 of the crew members. The plane takes off from Seattle about 7:30 p.m. that night, and that's the night before Thanksgiving, by the way. And somewhere over the southern Washington or northern Oregon state line, D.B. Cooper makes his exit out of the back end of that Boeing 727 by parachute, never to be seen again.
And yet, at some point later, money is found, and letters are sent, and this is what we've linked up at coasttocoastam.com tonight. These are letters that were also referenced in an article that was written in Reno, which is where the plane was headed.
Yes, and Ian, there's so little evidence left behind, physical evidence left behind in this case, that it's baffled the FBI, who, by the way, are the authorities that manage this case. But it's just one of the unsolved crimes that's turned into a legend. And I think part of the problem is the FBI, quite a while ago, decided that they were just going to say that D.B. Cooper could not have survived this jump. And that seemed to be something that's held up for a long time until recently. They've got a new case agent in Seattle who handles the case, and I've sat down with him a number of times now, right across the table, and we've had many discussions about this case, and I've exchanged information to him, and he has allowed me to see the evidence that the FBI has. And one thing he told me was that he believed D.B. Cooper survived the jump. And I asked him, well, that's quite a departure from what the other agents have been saying all these past 40 years. And he said, yes, it is. But I commend and applaud these new FBI agents, the younger guys, who have a very open mind. And we're talking about the letters tonight. That's what you have posted up. And this is part of some research that I've been doing here the last year. And the agent in charge of the case invited me in after I sent him a couple of these old letters, and apparently he didn't know about them because the Norjack case file is so big there's no way one agent can go through it when he's handling 40 or 50 other cases. So we've worked together and cooperatively, and tonight we're going to talk about these mysterious D.B. Cooper letters.
Well, and so we'll give a tip of the cap to Guy Clifton, who wrote a great piece about it in the paper in Reno, right?
That's
correct.
That's
the guy I hooked you up with?
Yeah, Guy contacted me, thanks to you, Ian, and he wrote up an article about the first letter. And I also want to make mention of this gentleman by the name of John Craig out of Denver. I've never met him, but we've corresponded a few times. And Mr. Craig is an investigative reporter, writes mostly on unsolved crimes. And if people want to examine some of these 1971 D.B. Coopers in detail, they can Google 1971 D.B. Cooper letters and then John Craig, that's C-R-A-I-G. And Mr. Craig really does get it right in this story.
Okay, so it was the Reno Gazette-Journal, and thank you for the work they were doing there to help try and keep the story alive. A lot of people sent me a link to that, including my friend George Knapp, who was nice enough to send the story our way too. And so what's really fascinating about this is that these letters, when you look at them, first of all, your feeling on them, they really were or weren't written by D.B. Cooper, the ones that we've linked up at coasttocoastam.com.
The FBI discounted these letters every time they appeared. In fact, I have evidence to show they probably suppressed the publication of at least one of these letters, and probably two. What I've done is I've examined the letters closely for not just the forensic content, but I'm mostly interested in where the letters were sent, where they were received, and the dates of both the sending and the receiving. Because what it does, Ian, is it leaves a timeline that's a very narrow timeline after the skyjacking that is, in my opinion, quite plausibly the trail left by the hijacker. And if you look at these letters in sequence, they're like little pinpoint lights that go off that mark the trail of the hijacker's escape route.
Okay, and that's key because, you know, after that, there are a bunch of copycats. I mean, immediately people do get into it, and it sort of creates a kind of like if this were a satellite image or something, it's like ground clutter. It's kind of hard to tell where the real thing is and where the fake stuff is because they're immediately other people started copying D.B. Cooper's stunt, and other people started claiming that they were D.B. Cooper because it became such an automatic, you know, sort of a public pop culture fan sensation.
Yeah, you're right, Ian. The thing about these letters is they all pretty much were sent within 1 week of the actual skyjacking, and that wasn't quite enough time for the information to get out there to the public as to who this hijacker really was, what he was doing, and where he jumped out, and all the particulars that are involved. 1 week is not enough time for a lot of copycatters to ply their trade because they need more information as to how this guy did it. And so I really believe because of the narrow time frame that these 4 letters were sent by the real D.B. Cooper.
Okay. So we've linked them up at coasttocoastam.com, and you can talk about this. And let me also ask you, I mean, we there was a Coast family that contacted Galen and brought forward evidence about their father, a guy named Bill Gossett. And we've been talking about this guy forever. He's passed on since, but all of the evidence left behind by him would, and this is over years and years of investigation, remains consistent with what we know about D.B. Cooper, and then also seems to anticipate some of the revelations that we find out about his life, anticipate things that we had known about D.B. Cooper, too. So things that were established separate facts. I mean, we know that, you know, he, for example, had this experience as a jumper in Vietnam. This would be another thing that would be consistent with D.B. Cooper. Not somebody did commercial jumping, but had done military style jumping. And these are all things that fit in with Bill Gossett. You can find out more about that evidence, too, that we've collected at coasttocoastam.com. I won't go into all of it here. But let me ask you about something that just came over tonight. Actually, George Knapp sent me the article about the tie clip and the titanium on the tie clip. Do you know about this?
Yeah, a little bit. It was collected by a group that the previous Nordjack case agent put together. It was a citizens sleuth group, and they had access to some of the D.B. Cooper files, and apparently they examined the tie, and under close microscopic observation, they found some titanium fragments on the tie.
Okay. This is fascinating to me because I think this is, again, it speaks to the idea that there are still clues out there. There is still physical evidence to be found in the existing files, that the more science we have and the more eyes we have on it, the more likely we're going to be to find those clues. And there has to be somebody like you, Galen Cook, who's willing to do the footwork to follow up and find out, you know, what does this mean and how could this work? So hang on for that. We'll get back to that coming up on Coast to Coast. I want to ask you about the titanium, that whether that's consistent with anything we know about our number one suspect on this, Bill Gossett. Could he have been exposed to titanium? And what about what some people are supposing is a motive, that somehow D.B. Cooper might have lost his job at this Boeing plant where he would have been exposed to titanium and took his revenge by hijacking a Boeing plane. We'll get back to that coming up on Coast to Coast. We'll also give you the number so you can join the conversation. Won't get in a lot of calls, but we'll get in some, and I hope maybe that'll be you too. Deadly Powers coming up next hour, not to be missed. We are all prey. You'd be stunned to hear the number of people who are still eaten every year. I know that sounds awful, but it's true. How many people are still eaten every year by prey, by predators? You won't believe it. And the variety of predators that are still out there, but how bad it was in the beginning and how few humans really did survive the mega predator era. We owe them a great debt of gratitude for being swift of feet and sound of mind. We'll get back to that next hour on Coast to Coast. So we'll just do a little more D.B. Cooper updating until the top of the hour on Coast to Coast. We'll get back to Galen Cook coming up in just a second. We'll probably have time for just a couple of calls, but if you're looking for clues on this like we are, perhaps you have some sort of fresh perspective as well. Before I go, I do want to say thank you to Dennis Reno, R-A-N-O. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Dennis Reno is a cartoonist. You may have seen his work posted here at coasttocoastam.com. I don't know what they did earlier in the week, but he did some sketches, some caricatures of all of us here at Coast to Coast. And I didn't see George Norrie's. I did see George Knapp's, which, by the way, I might add, didn't realize how much he looked like Kenny Rogers. But I absolutely love his caricature of me. And I tweeted that out earlier in the week. I think on Thanksgiving. And so I sent it out. Thank you. You just did a great job with it, Dennis. And my wife was crazy about it. Everybody's looking at it going, God, it's so you. I'll send that out again, coming up tonight for people that would have missed that. But it's fun. And thank you. It's always nice to hear from you coasties out there. And I hope all of you are toasty coasties tonight. It's a little cold. The winter is beginning to settle in for a good part of this country, and it was very cold and wet at the football game where I was this afternoon. It was blustery, and it made losing even the worse. But we'll I love to tweet out during the week, and if you want to join us too, coming up this Tuesday, remember I'm going to be doing the Coast Insider Chat. Sign up and become a Coast Insider, and we'll give you a couple of fun, tantalizing clues about something which is coming up next Saturday night on Coast to Coast. But first, let's get back to what we know about D.B. Cooper tonight, and about the titanium that was found on the tie, or on the tie clip, that D.B. Cooper left behind. And what does that say? Both about where D.B. Cooper might have come from, and then also about our number one suspect. Does it still fit him? Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. All right, so we'll get to a couple of calls coming up in a second for Galen Cook, the attorney who is also the number one D.B. Cooper sleuth in the country. And Galen, we have known for a long time that D.B. Cooper left behind a clip-on tie, right?
I've seen that tie.
Okay. And that tie that was left behind, along with a couple other physical clues, are all that we really have of the guy that jumped out of an airplane with all that money 40 years ago on the 24th. So it's cool that they're going through it, the sleuth group, looking for microscopic evidence, and they found titanium. Now, explain the significance of that, what it might tell us about D.B. Cooper, and how that pertains to our number one suspect, Bill Gossett.
Well, here's the problem, Ian. The titanium evidence doesn't offer a narrow enough clue, at least for me. It's too broad in scope, and it leads to too much conjecture. When I sat down with the FBI agent, the only thing we discussed about the tie was the DNA. That was the only thing, because titanium or other metallurgical tidbits on the tie, they don't pinpoint who the suspect might be. With DNA, you can pinpoint, and that's the only thing the FBI is really interested in. At least that was what the new agent told me. The problem with the tie is that the tie itself has been contaminated by being handled so many times. You got to remember, back in 1971, that there was no DNA testing, so I would imagine the agents probably handled the tie without rubber gloves and things like that back in that era. And so there's been too much cross-contamination on that tie, and the agent told me that at this point, right here today, he calls the evidence in the tie unreliable. And so that would pretty much even rule out a DNA possibility. I find the D.B. Cooper letters far better evidence to date than the tie itself.
All right, so this is where you can go to coasttocoastam.com and go take a look at those letters, which we believe brings us back to our number one suspect, which is Bill Gossett. And that Bill Gossett was a guy. We'll explain why he fits the profile, Galen, of D.B. Cooper.
Let me just run by these letters real quick. What I'd like to do in the little short time we have is I've done something a little different with my investigation. I'm investigating two people. I'm investigating D.B. Cooper, the hijacker, and I'm investigating Bill Gossett, a potential suspect. And what I'm trying to do at this point, Ian, is I'm trying to see if I can merge these two together as one. So as far as the letters go, I look at a critical timeline. The skyjacking took place Wednesday night, November 24th, 1971. The very first D.B. Cooper letter ever seen shows up in the Reno Evening Gazette newsroom on Monday morning, November 29th. That's 5 days after the hijacking. The cancellation stamp on the outer envelope says November 27th, 1971. That's Saturday. That's 3 days after the hijacking. And then this letter was sent out of Oakdale, California, which, interestingly enough, is about 20 miles north of where Bill Gossett lived for about 10 years. His family, in fact, his first family was having Thanksgiving dinner on Thursday night, November 25th, in Merced, California, which is just down the road. So that was the first important clue I looked at. The second letter, which even gets better, was received up in Vancouver, Canada, at the editorial offices of the Province newspaper, and it was received on December 1st, which is a Wednesday. Now, what makes this interesting is that the content of both of these letters share a similar phrase, if not actually identical. And here's the phrase: thanks for the hospitality. So what I did was I looked at the timeline of the dates that these letters were sent, and there's no way that anybody out there, a hoaxer or some copycat, could have seen the contents published in the first letter, the Reno Evening Gazette, and used that in the content of the second letter, which appeared a couple days later in Vancouver, Canada, over 1,000 miles away. So that tells me immediately that this is the same author, and the author wants you to know that. He's playing a game here, and this is part of his riddle, is he wants the authorities to figure out if this is the same person. Thanks for the hospitality in letter 1. Thanks for the hospitality in letter 2. They're both sent from different countries, one sent in the U.S. and one sent in Canada. At this point, the hijacker has escaped, and he's playing a game with the authorities. Now, why did he go to Canada? Well, it's always been my belief that, based on my interviews with numerous people, according to Gossett, he had put the money up in Canada, and here we have a letter sent by an author just days after the hijacking up in Canada saying thanks for the hospitality. And then he goes on to do a couple more things, which I found very interesting and sort of telling of Bill Gossett's psychology. The first paragraph in his letter to Vancouver is, the composite drawing on page 3 as suspected by the FBI does not represent the truth. Now, what is the author of that letter saying? What he's saying is that the first composite drawing of D.B. Cooper came out on Monday morning through the Associated Press and United Press International, and I call it Composite A, and it was an artist sketch drawn for the FBI of the hijacker. But it doesn't look anything like Gossett. And so here you got the author of this letter up in Canada right off the bat saying, hey, I'm up here in Canada, and this drawing that you have that came out Monday morning doesn't look at all like me. Well, that speaks a little bit to the vanity of the hijacker. And This is another one of Gossett's traits. Interestingly enough, the FBI months later came out with a new artist sketch. We call it Composite B, and that is the dead ringer for Bill Gossett. So Gossett must have been pretty happy with Composite B because he showed it to his third son once, and his third son said that looked just like his dad.
Well, I'll tell you what, this is a good chance to jump into some calls here. And again, this is kind of our annual update. We'll continue to track the story when major developments come about. Glad we could share those letters and people could take a look at that. And then also grab Summer here for you, Galen Cook on Coast to Coast. Summer, it says here, is in. Are you in Nashville, Summer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
Used to live there. Loved Nashville. What a great town.
Thank you.
So tell me real quickly. I understand you're Bill Gossett's niece.
Yes, I'm one of his nieces. My mother was a younger sister of his. My mother was. Her name was Jean.
Right.
Gossett.
Well, Galen Cook, Summer, Galen Cook. Yes. Go ahead.
Hi, Summer.
Hi. How are you doing?
Very good. Nice to hear you.
Thank you.
Well, did you have a question or any insight about him as
yes,
D.B. Cooper?
Yes, I actually do, Galen. I remember I was 10 years old in 1971, and my Uncle Billy was he was one of 5 children, and he was our favorite because he was just such a go-getter. He was fearless in meeting people, a very confident person. And in 1971, it was made known to us that he had a lot of money. And he was, like at Christmas time, there are 7 kids in my family, and he would give us all like $20 bills, which was a lot of money back then.
Sure was.
And my brothers that are older than I am, they would call him DB. Oh, there's DB Cooper, DB Cooper. And my other cousins the older cousins would talk about D.B. Cooper. And I didn't really know. I would just say, oh, D.B., oh, there's D.B. Cooper, and we would laugh about it. And I didn't know what it meant at the time. But my older brother, 2 of my older brothers, knew what it meant. And it was just very, very interesting. We just knew it. And he spent time in Canada. My cousin Greg is one of his sons,
right?
And he and I were close in age. He's a little younger than I am. His mother is Teresa. That was Billy's, maybe his second wife, maybe.
Right.
But yeah, he was. It's like everybody knew that he was part of this.
Well, and that, and I'm sure there's a few other families out there somewhere that can relate to that, where somebody was walking around and they were claiming that, and it became kind of a family motif. But Galen, was there anything else you wanted to get to here real quick?
Well,
we've got a couple
I've never talked with Summer before. In fact, it's the first time I've ever heard your name mentioned. But all I got to say, Summer, is you should have hang on to some of those 20s that Bill Gossett gave you, because it's worth a whole lot more today.
Oh, that's so funny.
Right.
Wouldn't that be great if she had one of those 20s still after all this time? Hey, Summer, I'm going to put you on hold. If you want to if you want to grab Summer's number, and then we can pass it along to Galen just in case he wanted to get in touch with her later on. So, Gina, if you can grab Summer's number, that'd be great. Steve is in Boise, Idaho on Coast to Coast for Galen Cook, our annual D.B. Cooper update. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Ian and Galen, thank you very much for taking my call. I love me some D.B. Cooper, and this is just a great show.
Scratch the itch, huh?
Galen, I just wanted to ask you a quick question. I'll take my answer off the air. What is the possibility of DB using a remailing service and staying in one central location and instead sending his letters off to a third party to have them mailed? And again, thank you for the show, and I'll take my call off the air.
It's a very interesting question. Bill Gossett was living in Ogden, Utah back in 1971. He was finishing up a career in the military, and he had several different friends in law enforcement in the Salt Lake City area. Bill Gossett loved to be around law enforcement people. In fact, Bill Gossett was a police officer for the Merced Police Department in the 1950s before he got kicked off the force. But back to addressing your question, there's a particular individual in Salt Lake City who was with the Sheriff's Department in one of the counties in Salt Lake who was very good friends with Bill, and he said that right around after work, Bill Gossett was working as a private investigator then, and they would routinely stop by one of those private postal offices, one of those mailbox offices, not associated with the government, but a private postal box. And Bill Gossett would go in every day and check his mail. And this gentleman who actually was a sheriff's deputy who had no knowledge of this back, in the 1980s, he said Gossett always used different types of mail service. And his son corroborates that information. So it's a great question, and Gossett was very weaselly there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. First-time caller line, John is in Lynn Haven, Florida, on Coast to Coast. John?
Mr. Punnett, what a pleasure. I love Coast to Coast.
Oh, glad to have you.
Cook, I have a question. This bailing out of the airplane seems to me to have always been an assumption on everybody's part since nobody actually saw him do it. Could it be that he accessed the cargo hold of that aircraft from the passenger compartment and somebody simply picked him up at the airport?
That's an interesting thought, actually.
Well, I'll tell you what, I appreciate that question. I don't think that's the case. When the plane landed in Reno at about 11 o'clock that night, believe me, the FBI was in force. They had dogs and everything you can imagine. They stormed that plane thinking the hijacker was still in there. In fact, the crew stayed they stayed locked in the cockpit until the FBI came and swept the plane. There's really no chance that Cooper could have stowed away in a cargo hold. I've talked to the living crew members, including two of the pilots, and they're all pretty certain that Cooper made his jump somewhere as the plane was way down the bottom end of Washington State or in northern Oregon. And the second officer of the plane told me he feels that way strongly because the instrument gauges on the plane were moving around quite a bit, which showed that there was some pressure changes from the rear of the plane and the front of the plane. So he bailed out, and he took his parachutes with him, too.
But I'm glad he asked the question so that we can address that. I think it's always good to go back over something like that. Don is in Lima, Ohio, and then we'll put it to bed until we've got more developments coming up on D.B. Cooper. Go ahead, Don.
Good morning, Ian. Yeah, I just was wondering, I heard about this D.B. Cooper incident for a long time. Well, I got to talking to a acquaintance of mine about it, and he put me on to a book in a library called The Real McCoy. That was a true story of D.B. Cooper. That was the name of the book.
Right.
Well, anyway, I read the book. And what happened was, as near as the book said, well, yes, he jumped out over out of the northwest and did go to Canada.
Right.
Well, he went to, I think, Toronto, and he was up there for 2 or 3 months.
Right.
And then he come back to the States,
Well, Don, we're going to run out of time here, but let's have Galen address. Let's have Galen address The Real McCoy, because I know that book's been around for a long time. So, Galen, 30 seconds.
That's a 20-year-old book. I've talked to the author of it, and he's kind of changed his mind a little bit. His name is Russ Callum, and we've talked a lot. That gentleman McCoy died in a shootout with the FBI. He was not D.B. Cooper. But Ian, I want to say this: when your listeners get a chance to go on the website, have them look real close at letter number 3. That might be the most interesting of all the 3 D.B. Cooper letters.
Love that. Go take a look at coasttocoastam.com and click on the letter link.
That's right. That's the letter that the FBI and the Portland Oregonian denied the existence of, but then I got to see the envelope of that letter in the FBI office just several months ago. That letter actually was sent out in Portland just about a day after the letter in Vancouver appeared. And this is the letter that says, "The system that beats the system, D.B. Cooper."
Love that. Thank you, Galen. You know that I'll get you back on as many times as it takes to solve this mystery once and for all. Thanks for keeping up and doing all the... Deadly Powers is a book about the history of predation on humans. This may be an unsettling subject for some. In fact, somebody had sent me a message via Twitter. Again, I'm loving people signing up, but at Deacon Punnett. And they were wondering whether they should listen to this show or some other show, Mr. Seka Cuckoo. And I said, don't listen to the show tonight if you're trying to get to sleep, because it'll just wreck your dreams. You're going to be chased all night in your dreams when you hear about how much of our human psychology, how much of our behavior, how much of our mythology, how much of everything it is to be human is shaped by the fact that we were prey a lot longer than mainstream science has been willing to admit. There's sort of this notion that we were apex predators from the second we stepped out on the savannah. No. And in some parts of the country, some parts of the world, we still aren't. In fact, it's really interesting to see the amount of people who are still prey, sadly, but interesting to see how many people are still prey to animals every year. The numbers are staggering. And that this has a lot more to do with our psychology than the fact that we are the top of the food chain, which we really in some ways still aren't. We'll get to that coming up in just a minute on Coast to Coast. Hey, Audrey Pants, and to Debbie Seven, and to Benny Dreadful, and to everybody else who's signing up there. Thanks. We got a big thing coming up on Tuesday night, too. Hope you sign up for Coast Insider. Tuesday night, I'll be doing the chat. Look forward to meeting with you, and coming up a week from tonight, got kind of a fun, interesting, big announcement on the way next Saturday night on Coast to Coast. Let's get started, though, with the deadly powers of the animal predators and the mythic imagination with Dr. Paul Trout next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Well, Dr. Paul Trout is a retired professor at Montana State University, where he still serves as professor emeritus, taught English forever. I would have loved to have had you when I was getting my undergrad in English. Dr. Paul Trout, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian.
What a conspicuous last name for a book about being prey.
That's right.
Deadly Powers, Animal Predators and the Mythic Imagination. You can link up to this book at coasttocoastam.com. So let's talk about the traditional belief about us as being apex predators, and how it is that you're differentiating your theories here in this book from the kind of the traditional accepted mainstream view.
Well, I like to think that Deadly Powers sacrifices a number of sacred cows to my beliefs here, and one of them is the reigning notion that we were killer apes or various very dangerous hunting apes back in the Pleistocene, roughly around 2 million years ago. that it is accurate to describe our species, even at that time, as Homo nicans, or man the killer. I just cannot buy into those reigning beliefs, although they are now being interrogated and undermined by a number of scholars working in anthropology and paleoanthropology, and we're starting to see that this simply could not be. Our ancestors, ancient ancestors, I'm talking now about Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, Homo habilis, were very small creatures. They had no weapons. They were not nearly as strong as the chimpanzees that we study today, and that they must have lived in constant fear of the animals that dominated the landscape for those 2 million years. At this time, there were more mammalian predators than at any time before or since. Huge animals, much larger lions, tigers, leopards than we have today, and then other now extinct animals that were extremely fearsome and well-armed in every way. I'm suggesting that the better way to describe early humans is Homo prida, or man the fearful.
Right. And we'll get to the rogues gallery of that period here in just a minute, because it truly is fascinating to consider what what our ancestors were up against to survive to get where we were today, and even how few of them there would have been. But so this is the push, and I love it, is that if we really think about the things that define who we are today, they tie more naturally to a kind of hidden psychology, a kind of hardwiring into our brains of a self-perception of us as prey, that we may not want to admit it. We fight it. We do things to almost seem to overcompensate for it, but that deep down inside, we still think of ourselves as prey, and that we have to do something about it. And that seems much more consistent with some of our mythology, some of the things, not all of them, but some of the things that might pop up in the Bible, things that pop up in our art, our pop culture, certainly movies, music. I mean, all of these things seem to be shaped by that understanding that we're really a lot closer to being lunch than we want to admit.
That's right. Throughout world art, and my focus is on world mythology, we are dealing with the intense fear that our sense of being a prey species, all too delectable to animal predators, in one way or another. We're simply dealing with it, and we still deal with it in contemporary movies, and we only get a sense of this when I live in bear country in Montana, and you get a sense of this when you go out into the woods on a long hike, and you do not prepare yourself with pepper spray or with a handgun. You all of a sudden realize that you are vulnerable to being attacked by a grizzly or a black bear, and you're going to probably come out on the losing end.
Right. And pepper spray or a handgun might not even have been enough go back a few tens of thousands of years. Let's talk about the era of the saber-toothed tiger. This seems to be a pivotal time for us in the human race. And there's no dispute that humans were alive during the era of the saber-toothed tiger. That is to say, not what we're talking. We're not talking about running away from T-Rexes, but we're talking about later on kind of the rise of mammals. So if you could, and feel free to take as long as you want with this because it's so fascinating in the book Deadly Powers, the giant beasts that existed at the time and how far their range was across the world.
Well, they dominated the world, and almost from pole to pole. But at the time that we were evolving, at first, of course, on the African savanna, animal predators extended everywhere. And under the term animal predators, I include, of course, the great killer cats. There were lions, the cave lion, which was monstrous. There were leopards. There were tigers. And there were the saber-toothed tigers that we refer to as tigers, but they really were a separate species. But they were also the number of varieties of them, as a matter of fact. And then on top of these animals, there were hyenas and wolves and packs of feral dogs, of course. The hyenas were so prevalent that they extended into England, which had a much warmer climate, and they're still finding remains of hyenas in caves in England. They were a very dangerous predator.
I want to jump in here and say this. I want to go through some of the statistics that you put in here, and I say kind of from the archaeological record. For example, in the killer cats category that you mentioned, Dr. Trout, the Smilodon, which ranged from Western Canada to South America, had canine tusks 10 inches long and weighed over 750 pounds. That's twice the weight of today's African lion. And there's plenty of archaeological record that says that they used to regularly puncture with those giant tusks human skulls. That this is something that we know to exist. Correct?
That is correct.
And that this was originally misidentified when they would find the punctures in the skulls, and they thought it was from arrows or from that archaeologists didn't necessarily connect the saber-tooth punctures to the skulls. They thought it might have been weapons, human-to-human weapons.
That's right. It took a lot of research from specialists, particularly in South Africa, to really develop very good hard evidence that the human remains that were deposited in certain areas were killed by leopards who had dragged the hominin up into a tree and fed on it, and then the remains dropped in. Eventually, over years, there'd be a pile of it, and sometimes they'd be dragged into caves. But yes, we have very hard evidence that the puncture wounds have been inflicted by particularly leopards, but also by huge raptors, maybe an eagle, or maybe some other a condor or some other large aerial raptor. The sizes of them at that time were immense. They had wingspans of 17 feet and sometimes a body weight of 50 pounds, and were very able, as indeed eagles are still today in Africa, to swoop down and kill a hominin with just one plunge of the talons.
Then there was the Dinofelis, or the Dinofelis, right. The terrible cat. I thought this was really interesting because this was not just a large killing machine, but also he was kind of a climbing machine, a giant beast that you describe, or somebody describes, as our ancestors' worst nightmare. Why is that? Well,
because it could climb up a tree, and that is the only place that we could find protection at that time. In fact, we probably were still semi-arboreal at that time, so the Dinofelis could just they ranged throughout North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and they could just chase us right up a tree. We had no way of of protecting ourselves, unless, of course, we went high up into the tree and on the weaker branches and hope that they couldn't pursue us that high.
And this is fascinating because, as you say, now this gets into the idea of how this imprints on us and perhaps gets hardwired in us, is the thought of getting away. How do we get away from these things? And if the early humans would have been walking through the woods, it would not have been uncommon for them to have seen maybe even people that they know, the carcasses up in the trees rotting, and how unnerving that would have been everywhere you go to have reminders that even the trees aren't safe.
Yeah, I try to sort of revivify the experiences that our very ancient ancestors would have had just living in this environment. And I point out that they would have seen immense amounts of blood, not only from their own, of course, but from the animals, the prey animals that predators would have killed. They would have seen stacks of bones littering the landscape. They would have heard the sounds of predation all the time. And by sounds of predation, I don't mean just the actual agonized squeals and howls of animals being literally torn apart by predators, but the growls, the calls of lions, which can be heard miles and miles away, and the alarm calls of all the other animals that would have been sending them out on almost a constant basis. So I try to capture the sound of the Pleistocene environment, and it must have been very unnerving for our ancestors to be, live within this milieu that was noisy with death and which was littered with corpses, bones, and kill sites.
Yeah. And to back up your case, which I think is really interesting, again, we're talking about the book Deadly Powers, which makes, in large part, a novel claim that we are shaped much more as human beings by our tens of thousands of years that we spent as being prey as opposed to being an apex predator, and that many well-known anthropologists, including Louis Leakey, just couldn't accept the idea that we've been meat for thousands of years.
That's right, and neither could Joseph Campbell. He simply did not. He pulled back from any suggestion that we were anything but hunters in his well worked out analysis of mythology, which is quite an achievement, simply focused on man the hunter and on hunting guilt that resulted from that. But before we were hunters, before we had spears, and then the remarkable weapon of bow and arrow, which could kill at a distance, we had no weapons. We must have been man the hunted.
Well, but to back up your case, and this is so fascinating, here we're well past spears, bows, and arrows, and yet to this day around the world we are still prey. And you talk about some of the numbers that come out of India of the number of people who are still prey to animals every year.
Oh, India and Africa, thousands are lost every year from animal predators. So
we don't even think about that. I don't think that doesn't enter into our consciousness. I don't think of the number of tigers that are still on the prowl collecting people from villages on what might be 3 or 4 a day for the country of India.
That's right, and particularly the Indo-European crocodiles that are in the swamp areas and the water areas, because many people have to go to these areas to gather water, and that's when they encounter these animals, and of course they're apparently thriving. So I encountered a fellow student who was at MSU from Kenya, working at, of all places, in Walmart, and I noticed his accent. We got into a conversation and told me he was from Kenya, and I said, well, I'm working on a book that says this, and am I on the right track? And he said, you certainly are. He said, in my village, we would not go out after nightfall.
Oh, yeah.
We could not get to our mailboxes, which were miles away, to get mail delivery. They would not walk that distance or even bike it in some cases. They had to wait for somebody who had a car to drive them the 30 or 40 miles to pick up their mail.
Oh, yeah.
And they lived today, now, in constant fear of the animals in the environment.
You know, that's so interesting because I know some missionaries who spent some time actually in Kenya, and they are in farming areas where they help communities with self-sustaining farming, and it all shuts down at night, and all of the safeguards go up for the lions. They have to put up, all the tin cans and all of the lights, and there's somebody that sits up every night with a gun. And they are in a rural developed area. They're not near a jungle, but they're hungry and they come looking. Well, I want to give you just a little tip here then. Coming up just a second, we'll talk more about the lizards. We'll talk about the giant snakes and crocodiles and alligators that hunted our ancestors, and the giant bears, as well as the wolves, and most fearsomely, perhaps, the dogs that were out there, and how that shapes us to this day. More of that coming up about deadly powers on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. We're talking about deadly powers. Dr. Paul Trout, the author of a book which forces us to reimagine ourselves today as prey more than we think we'd like to be. We like to think of ourselves as kind of always in charge with exceptions. But that may not be actually how our minds work. We may be fighting hard our hardwired understanding of ourselves as somebody else's meal. And that this might speak to our current mythology, all of the predators in our pop culture, our obsession with monsters and werewolves and vampires. Could this all come really from tens of thousands of years of having been formed, being chased, of having to survive just even so much as the daily task of going to get water? We'll talk about the dangers of that and how few a number we actually might come from. How many predators were out there would indicate how few of us there might have been left, and how it could have we might have been an endangered species that didn't make it. We could have been the dodo bird. We'll tell you about that next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So we're talking with Paul Trout, retired professor from Montana State University. I thought it was an interesting connection you made to the fact that you're still out. If you go out in the woods, you have to, even in Montana, you have to have pepper spray and guns. It makes only sense that you would do that. The same thing true for a lot of predators that still circle even around me here in the Twin Cities. We still have mountain lions. We still have a ton of coyotes, which aren't necessarily, a threat to humans, but they're still predators. And as are the wolves that get ever closer to populated areas again. And this goes back to our earliest days while we were being formed as prey. Talk about the giant wolves and the packs of dogs, because it seems like some of the dogs could actually be bigger than the wolves back before they were more, commonly domesticated.
Well, of course, that the wolves have been introduced into the ecosystem of this area and are doing fairly well. Now we have a wolf hunt, which is controversial, but apparently there are enough wolves to sustain a, quote, harvest, end of quote, of about 75, I believe, a year. So far, I do not think there have been any attacks on humans. And sometimes you hear that, well, wolves never attack humans. Well, that's just simply not true. The wolves of the Pleistocene, the dominant species was called the dire wolf, and you can see many examples of their skeletons here in this country, in Los Angeles at the famed La Brea tar pits, where thousands of them got mired in tar over several thousand years in an attempt to get at the prey species who themselves were mired in the tar. And as a result, we have just a wonderful collection of dire wolf skeletons and heads on display there. The dire wolf was a very dangerous animal, and it was about a third of the size larger than the wolf of today. And it hunted in large packs, probably of up to 50. And at that number, there was probably no land animal predator or herbivore that could withstand an attack from dire wolves. Now, even the contemporary wolf, which is much smaller, is mythologized throughout Europe as a dangerous predator. In Siberia, as late as 1927, a village named Pilovo was besieged by a pack of wolves that were so hungry that they knocked down the doors of the villagers and killed I don't know how many hundreds of people, until it took armed troops to actually come in and rescue the residents.
You know, what's so fascinating about that is just how common, in a way, those types of experiences are. And I didn't quite understand it as we make the connection here in Deadly Powers, that around the world, there are still, as we've talked about India, we've talked about rural Africa, here you're talking about the wolves, that there are still places where it is a struggle just to go get water, just to wash your clothes, or to let your children bathe. It's not safe. I mean, it really isn't. It's not safe. It may not be that they're not going to get everyone, but they get, I mean, like millions of people around the world to this day are still victims of predators.
In Africa, you mentioned the dogs. That certainly holds true for the dogs that exist. It's really hard to think of man's best friend as once being predators, but they were, and you see it mythologized in a number of areas, and for example, the Maya book Popol Vuh. But these, at one time, dogs existed in many different shapes and species. They were given names like the cat-like dog, a hyena-like dog, and a bear-like dog. The bear-like dog weighed about 200 pounds. And was a kind of strange.
Enormous. That's like 80 pounds more than a Great Dane.
Right.
I mean, that's like I can't even picture that, and that there would be 50 of them hunting in a pack.
That's exactly right. And this particular one was a strange blend that had the hind legs of a large cat, which meant that it could pounce, and the teeth of a wolf. And remains of bear-like dogs have been unearthed in California. There were plundering dogs and other dogs called bone-crushing dogs, naturally because they possessed extremely powerful jaws and teeth like hyenas do. Hyenas, I lump with dogs, although they're really a different species, but they look and act like dogs. They had jaws so powerful that they could crush every bone in the human body to powder, leaving only the skull.
And so these types of hyenas, and you mentioned them briefly that because they ranged all the way into England, but these are hyenas that weighed 450 pounds in the Pleistocene.
That's right.
Okay, 450-pound hyenas. What today they might weigh more commonly 90 pounds?
That's right.
100 pounds? I mean, these, and so if we start to add up the number of predators out there, then we realize, well, we're not even done. So before we add up the number of predators, let's address the bears, because it's that short-faced bear that you can't imagine anybody could have survived, even somebody with a bow and arrow. It's hard to imagine that somebody out there could have survived an attack from an 11-foot eating machine like the short-faced bears.
Because when it stood up, its head was higher than a basketball hoop. And yeah, I have a illustration in the book comparing the size of a short-faced bear with that of a grizzly. And the short-faced bear skull looks to me as if it's 3 to 4 times the size of a grizzly.
It looks like a comparison between a car tire and a bicycle tire.
That's right. And it has, they were a formidable predator. They did eat meat, of course. They ranged throughout Europe and Asia, North and South America. And it has been suggested that North America could not be populated until the species went extinct.
That's so interesting that they were the they had to go, or it would have been that it was them or us.
Yeah, well, actually, we didn't play much of a part in their extinction. There's a debate, of course, about what is called the Pleistocene extinction of these large predators, and I'm not a specialist in this area, but I'm inclined to think that if we played any role, it was killing the prey animals that these larger predators preyed on for meat, so that we could not take them on. And there was probably a change in the climate, and other things may have occurred that simply reduced the number of prey animals, and that resulted in these top of the food chain animals becoming extinct.
They got starved out. I want to get to the part about crocodiles. Again, we mentioned this briefly, but again, we're talking about the book Deadly Powers, in the chapter Bringers of Death, and how our ancestors were shaped by, how we are still connected to, how we are hardwired to believe, to understand ourselves as prey. You write, it's reasonable to assume that crocodiles ate humans in the distant past just as they do today. The Nile croc is reputedly the biggest killer of humans on the African continent, responsible for more human deaths than lions, leopards, buffaloes, hippopotamuses, hyenas, rhinoceroses, and elephants combined. According to one author, the crocodiles of the Sundarbans are, quote, man-eating monsters of the worst kind, more deadly than the sharks that also infest the coastal waters. And most of those killed are women and children, because women with children spend a great deal of time at rivers drawing water or washing clothes. We're talking about huge numbers, and you mentioned here one in particular, that an African crocodile that was killed had his stomach contents examined, and they found 11 heavy brass arm rings, 3 wire armlets, wire anklets, a necklace, 14 human arm and leg bones, and 3 human spinal columns in his stomach. Is that right?
That's correct. And what's interesting is our recent ancestors, the myth makers, mythologized all of this in myth. One Polynesian myth recounts the slitting open of the stomach of a, quote, great lizard, and exposing amazing sights of headless headless bodies, armless, legless men, women, and children. So this was done in the past. I mean, this sort of autopsy was done in the past, and they discovered the same things we discover today.
It's amazing. And the same thing true with lizards. Now, this part perhaps is more accessible to a lot of people. This is something that has been considered, which is why I like this as kind of a door into the topic in general. If people are trying to get an idea of the connection between the fossil record and our mythology is lizards. Because that makes a lot more sense when we think about dragons as being sort of the remnant of encounters with past giant lizards. And we're not talking dinosaurs.
That's correct. The largest lizard that we know about right now is called Megalolania, and it grew to almost 30 feet in length, as long as a large python, but of course it had a full body because it weighed more than 2,000 pounds. These lizards thrived in Australia and on some Pacific islands up to about 50,000 years ago. Now, did we encounter them? Well, yes, we probably did, because that is about the time given for the colonization of Australia by people from Asia. So we probably did encounter them. There also have been some suggestion that they still exist. There have been sightings for example, in the 70s of the tracks, and some say the sighting of a huge animal, a huge lizard. Now, that's not been tracked down, but they may still exist. We certainly thought that the Komodo dragon was extinct until they were found in about 1912. So, it's possible that the Megalolania and or some descendant of it is alive and well even in Australia today.
You know, the that notion too that when that's what formed us is that we kept thinking about these dragons that used to get us, and that we still have to get them, and that our chivalry was based on this notion of protecting the women and the children from dragons. And it really makes a lot more sense when we think that there really were dragons. And it wasn't just necessarily that they found the bones, that maybe what we found was something deep in our own, buried in our own psyche, a kind of sense memory of ourselves as prey.
Well, that's a good observation. An anthropologist named David E. Jones wrote a book called An Instinct for Dragons. It's a very sophisticated argument, and I can't possibly do justice to it here. But in essence, what he is arguing is that the dragon is a composite of the three most dangerous predators of the primate line for millions of years. The raptor, the snake, and the land animal, some sort of cat. So what he's saying is that if you look at the body of a dragon, typically seen throughout the world, you're going to see body parts from these three dominant predators of the primate line, basically a python, a leopard, and an eagle. Now, they can be these body parts can be arranged in different ways, but they'll all be present in a dragon. Now, what he also goes on to say is this mythic creature was the creation of the human mind around the time that our species left the safety of the trees and went into the very dangerous savanna. Now, what he goes on to argue is that the mind of Australopithecus, which was much smaller than the mind of Homo erectus, was overloaded. It had to deal with too many new predators, too many new threats. And it sort of encapsulated these three traits into a mythic predator called he calls the brain dragon. They had no name for it probably, but it meant to them very dangerous animal.
Right.
So it was a short